Alright guys, Tom Hunt here in the kit room, and today's subject, I know this is going to twist my noodle, it's probably going to twist yours too. That subject is braid. For something that is what seems so simple is absolutely a minefield when you dig into it. But I get questions around braid all the time. It seems to be really confusing for people. When do they use it? What are the other options? What the hell's PE? What diameter do I go for? Do I pick on breaking strain or diameter? Do I go for 4 strand, 8 strand, 12 strand? What colour do I use? It's an absolute minefield, all right? So I'm going to run through a few of my personal recommendations, but it is one of those subjects which can be quite personal. Everyone's got a slightly different feel, so you are going to have to do a little bit of your own research and find out what works for you as well. These recommendations, they're all branded, they're not the cheapest, but I'll come on to those later and I'll tell you exactly why I use certain brands. All right, so let's get started. So a question I get if you're a beginner, for example, is what options of line have I got to put on my reel? And you've really got 3 options. You've got monofilament, you've got fluorocarbon, and you've got braid. So a quick rundown of the pros and cons of each of them. And I'm sure I'll miss a few. If I do, stick them in the comments below. Add your comments because this is always a conversation, all right? I can't cover absolutely everything. I'm going to forget a few things. Monofilament, it's the cheapest line to put on your reel by far. All right, it's your old school Maxima, Bayer Purlon. Go into a fishing shop, they're always going to have a bit of a variety of monofilament. All right, it's the cheapest. It's got the most amount of stretch, which doesn't make it ideal for lure fishing because all of that stretch means that we lose a lot of the bite and a lot of the feel, which is one of the reasons why we use braid so much, but it is still an option. So it's cheap, it's got a lot of stretch, but it is tough as old boots, and you can replace it as often as you like. Fluorocarbon, similar to monofilament in terms of look, but when you get it under the water, it's got a refractive index, which is virtually the same as water, which basically makes it look invisible. However, it's a little bit stiffer, doesn't have that suppleness to it. It's a little bit harder, but it's see-through, as I mentioned, but it's also more expensive. So you've got to kind of weigh it up. Fluorocarbon, by definition, is also denser than water, which basically means it sinks. So again, it's not always applicable for lure fishing in all different situations. If you wanted a deep running crankbait, potentially look at fluorocarbon because the weight of the line will sink and it will get your bait down. But if you want the opposite scenario, if you want to fish top water, you don't want to use fluorocarbon because as it sinks, it's going to start pulling your top water lure under the water. All right, so mono, cheap, stretchy, tough as old boots. Fluorocarbon, invisible, stiff, sinks, so not applicable in every situation and a bit more expensive. And then braid. Let's come on to braid. So braid is obviously a completely different material. So what is it made of? It's made of a material called PE. Now that might get confusing because there's also a chart called a PE rating, which tells you the relationship between the diameter and the breaking strain. But I'll come on to that in a second. PE is what braid is made of. It's called polyethylene. All right, if you want to look it up, go and look it up. There's some YouTube videos of in the factories. It's a process called gel spun. Yeah, I won't get into it now, but that's how they make it. Now what they do is they extrude single strands of this PE and then they make it into braids. Now that's often called the carrier rate or the number of strands. All right, so if you look onto a spool, it's going to have 3 strand, or it might say 4 strand, or it might say 8 carrier, or it might say 12 strand. That's all the same thing, and that's basically the number of strands that are woven together. Now if you look at this, for example, to the naked eye and to the feel, it almost feels like a single strand. But I know for a fact this is 8 strand or 8 carrier braid because that's how I purchase it. All right, but that can be a confusing factor. So when would you choose each of those? The lower the strand rate, so a 3-strand or a 4-strand, for example, will be the cheaper end of braids. They're a little bit more abrasion resistant, but braid in general is not as abrasion resistant as fluorocarbon or mono that we had in the first 2 instances. All right. So if you are fishing around a lot of timber, a lot of rocks, braid can shear off quite easily. You can get a lot of damage, small bits of damage on it as well. So again, I'll make some recommendations later on how to protect your rods and how to protect your braid. But out of the difference between 3-strand and say 12-strand, the 3-strand at the basic end is going to be a little bit more abrasion resistant. All right, it's a little bit tougher. However, you can really feel it with 3 or 4 strand. Imagine like a braided hair plait. Yeah, it might be your sister, your mum, your wife, whatever. If there's 2 or 3 strands in that plait, say there's 3 strands, it's going to have a very coarse weave to it. All right, you're going to be able to see the weaves, and it's going to have sort of slightly almost lumpy edges to it. And when you get a 3 or a 4-strand braid in between your fingers, you can feel how kind of coarse it is. This also converts into when you're casting through the rod rings. Any modern rod rings that we've got with ceramic inserts, it can make a hell of a lot of noise, almost like a buzzing sort of noise coming through the rod rings, which I don't mind so much. It's not the greatest, but some people do worry about whether that noise transmits down the line towards your lure as well, and it could potentially be something that puts the fish off. All right, so it is cheaper, but it's more noisy, but it is a little bit more abrasion resistant. As you come up into your 8 strands, and now we're up towards 12 strands, or Suffix do one that's 13 strands and above. You know, we're getting into much rounder profiles because the individual strands are slightly smaller, and when they're weaved all together, there's a process as well where they've got coatings in them, and the best high quality braids almost feel just like one strand. Super smooth, they're super quiet through the rings, they're not as abrasion resistant, but they are your top quality braids. All right, I think I've covered enough stuff there. And braid, obviously, because of lure fishing, when we get those bites, especially if we're finesse fishing and we're not fishing on the direct wind the whole time, if we're ever fishing methods where we've got little bits of slack in the line, or we're fishing a little bit slower, or we're fishing for delicate species like smaller perch or smaller zander, or it's really cold water, braid is virtually your only option, because we want to be able to transmit as much of that energy and as much of that bite up to the rod as possible, and that's what braid does. Braid is so fine and so non-stretch, so direct, that if you pulled an inch at one end on the rod, on the lure, you would feel 1 inch pull on the rod tip. All right, whereas if you had mono or fluorocarbon, you'd pull 1 inch at the lure, and you might only get half an inch, quarter of an inch, 3/4. It depends how much, you know, but the longer the cast, the more stretch you've got to lose that bite. So that's generally the reason that we use braid for lure fishing. So let me run through some real life scenarios. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to pick up my ultralight setup here, and this, you can see it's pink. This is a Suffix Nanobraid. All right, it is about 0.06 of a millimeter, I believe. So quick point on that. You will get PE rating systems. If you go online, Google PE rating chart, there is a standardized, it comes from a Japanese silk industry of deniers of how thick strands are compared to this rating system. So it's meant to be industry standardized. However, that is the one thing I tell people not to look at. Look at the diameter directly that's advertised on the spool, or look at the breaking strain on the spool. They're the only 2 ways that I do it. When you look at the PE system, it's been bastardized so much over the years. There's a minefield as well, difference between Japanese, European and American ratings, and it will just do your head in. So I generally avoid looking at the PE rating system. All right, so let's go by diameter or breaking strain. So Suffix Nanobraid, I think I'm using this in £7. I think the lightest is £6, 6, 7, £8. And I use this for my canal setups. Use it for small perch, small zander, small pike, where I'm using probably maximum like 3-inch lures. Most of the time I'm probably fishing 1.5, 2-inch lures, and very, very small and delicate where I'm casting not very far. And even on those canals or small rivers, when I'm getting a little bit of wind, I want all of that finesse to be cutting through the water, cutting through the wind. I don't want big bows in my line, so I want the thinnest line possible, and that's about 0.06 I've got on there. The other scenario that I do use that braid sometimes is when I'm vertical jigging for zander. So for you guys in the UK, we've got a place called Rutland where we're often catching smallish zander, and they're relatively deep. And you really want to, what we found there is the numbers of bites that you get, the smaller the jig head that you've got on. So the thicker the braid I've got on, if I was using, say, a 7 or an 8-pound braid compared to, say, a 20-pound braid, I would, on a given day, in order to present my lure properly, on the 7-pound braid, I might be able to get away with, say, an 18-gram jig head, and in the same conditions with a 20-pound braid, I might be having to fish 25 grams or maybe even 30 grams to get the same amount of presentation that I'm after, which is, you know, not bowing too much in the water when you're fishing deep, not having it swing away too much as the boat's drifting while you're vertical jigging. All right, so it does make a difference. So occasionally I will go that light, but if I'm fishing for better size zander, anything over like £5, I generally won't use that. I will step up a little bit because I need a bit more durability. Next step up for me then sounds like we're moving up a hell of a lot in terms of breaking strain, because I move up to like 14-pound or 16-pound YGK G-Sole. Now, someone's going to correct me on here because I've got a feeling that YGK G-Sole has now changed its name, and I don't know what it's changed its name to, but I can find out for you. If you know, stick it in the comments below. Please help me out. But I go up to 14-pound is the lightest it comes in, or 16-pound. Now, I actually go for the 16-pound more often than not. It's still 0.08 of a mil. So 0.06 of a mil was £7. I now go up to 0.08 of a mil, and I'm up to 14 pounds. So how do I only get a little bit more in diameter, but double the amount in breaking strain? YGK G-Sole is one of the most expensive braids you can get. It's the best part of 35, 36, could even be 40 quid for a spool. All right, so it's not cheap. It is the best braid that I've had. If they offered it in a 0.04 mil for £7, I would buy it, but they don't. £14 is the lightest that they offer, but it is incredibly thin and it's fantastic. So 9 times out of 10, if I'm not completely finessing when I'm vertical jigging, that's going to be my braid. It's going to be £14 or £16 YGK G-Sole, and it comes in a beautiful, I've got it on a Vanford here, so got it on a Westin finesse shad. That's on a Vanford, and it's smooth as silk. It's absolutely delightful. Super thin, super strong, and it's just an absolute winner. I also use, this is by Favourite. Now, it's called Favourite 8-strand something or other. I'll probably try and put the link in the description. Comes in an orange colour, which can really help. So orange, green, pink, they come in a few different colours. If I was only ever going to get one colour, it would be green. It's just, for me, the visibility of it is absolutely fantastic. You've got to remember as well with lure fishing that we've only got the rod, the braid, and then it goes straight down to the lure, all right? Where I grew up match fishing So we were taught that when we were using a float or when we were using a quiver tip, that you had to read the float or read the quiver tip in order to tell what was in your peg. So it might get tiny little dinks, you might get slight lifts. That would tell you a hell of a lot about where the fish were in the water and what they were doing. Same on a quiver tip. If you were feeder fishing, you might get line bites. You know, there's a variety of different ways that you can read the tip to do with, you can tell how much undertow there is. All of that sort of stuff. In lure fishing, we don't really have that. The only way that we've got is the braid. So watching the braid like you would watch a float tells me a huge amount. And I've had days before where I'm fishing zander in particular, and I'm watching that braid like a hawk. And even though there's zero stretch, and even though there might only be a tiny little bow in the line, they might only be nudging that lure a quarter of an inch, and it just ever so slightly gets lost, and I see the bite more than I feel the bite. And if I can watch that braid like a hawk and I can react to that, that ends up with fish in the net rather than not watching it, waiting or expecting to get a really hard wrench, which doesn't always happen in terms of bites, and you are going to miss a lot of fish because they'll peck it and they'll spit it out, and they'll peck it and they'll spit it out. And if you're not watching the braid, you don't know anything about that. All right, so get a good colour that works well for the conditions that you're in, light conditions, the colour of the water. You might have trees on the far side, you might have blue, you know, open gravel pits, so you get much more of that white or sort of grey surface to the water. Find a braid that works for you on your venues, all right, but always keep an eye on that braid. Moving through, so that's YGK in the middle ones, and then I also use YGK, but on my, so this setup, for example, so this is an absolute dream. This is kind of like my medium pike setup. I've got it on a Westin W8, what have we got it on here? Power Strike, so 8 foot, 30 to 80 grams. Absolute dream to use this rod. It's light as a feather, and I've got it here with a 30-pound YGK. Now this is an 8-strand braid. It's super smooth, but it still gives me the insurance that I need at 30 pound. I used to use Power Pro Super 8 in about 25 pound, I think it was. I really like that braid. It never really let me down. It gets a little bit furry. For any of you guys out there, you might have noticed that if you've used it in the past. But with YGK being so thin, I think they do a 25 pound, but for a little bit of insurance, it's honestly, even this 30 pound is so thin, it makes me feel like for pike fishing, I should even step up even a little bit more on my medium setup, just because it's so thin, all right, just for a bit of added durability. But the thinness gives you distance on the cast. So I'm a boat angler, reservoir angler, and I can't tell you how often on those pressured waters I'm getting a lot of my bites the further away from the boat as possible, because they've seen it all before. I need to keep the boat away from them. So long casts for me is absolutely critical. And then coming through into like heavier setups, I then start looking in terms of diameter, all right, instead of breaking strain. So I started off at the beginning with 0.06. I was selecting that Nanobraid because it was so thin. The middle periods, I'm looking more at kind of breaking strain, 14 pounds, 16 pound, up to sort of 30 pound, like that kind of breaking strain. And then when I'm up to my heavy again, I'm looking probably a little bit more at diameter again. All right, so good recommendation. I've got the Power Cast here, 7'9". This throws 60 to 150 grams, but I would happily use this reel on my monster stick as well, which throws up to 240, 280 maybe, can't remember. It's a hell of a heavy rod, but I'm looking in that instance for complete durability, and I go for somewhere between 0.32 and 0.35 braid. That will put me around about somewhere between 50 and 80 pound, depending on the braid. I think I've got So here's a tip as well. I could find out, I'm obviously using the camera on my phone. I've got a notes section on my phone where every time I spool up a reel, I write it down. Don't trust your memory. And with the number of rods and reels that I've got, having a look around, I've got 3, 4, 10, I've probably got about 15 or 18 rods just in the vicinity of me here. Some of them I can tell straight away what braid it is. Other ones, can't quite remember what date it was. Can't quite remember, oh, is that the new braid that I tried or someone gave me or whatever. So I write down when I put the braid on, the date, the breaking strain, the brand, the diameter, that type of stuff, and the reel that I've put it on. So if I'm ever swapping reels and I'm not quite sure, I have a look on the notes section on my phone and I can figure it out, because it makes a big difference. It makes a big difference if you're crankbait fishing, because you might want to get the maximum depth out of your crankbaits. You can't go too light on your crankbaits, because some of them we're throwing 20 grams to 28 grams, you know, that's up to an ounce. You're going to need some durability to give super long casts on your deep cranking. So you can't go too light because you don't want to be cracking off. At the same time, you can't go too heavy, because you're not going to hit that maximum depth. The thickness of that braid is going to parachute, all right, and stay up in the water. The thicker the braid is, the more difficult it is to cut through the water. The thinner the braid, the more direct you're going to be, all right? But you've got to find that balance between durability on the cast, and obviously while you're cranking, you're winding a lot, but finesse that helps it kind of get down, all right? So certain methods are much more critical with braid than others. As a general rule of thumb, for most of my mid-range perch, I could get away with a bit of light piking on it as well, but perch and a bit of zander fishing, that YGK in the 14 or 16 pound is absolutely spot on. To be honest, arguably, I could put it on my finesse canal rods. It's so thin at 0.08 of a mil. It's absolutely fantastic. And you know, you could, if someone said to me, oh, you can only canal fish with 14 pound YGK, then I'd be like, okay, fine. So occasionally I do go just get that extra bit of thinness out of the Nanobraid, but I would be happy with the YGK, but it is incredibly expensive. About 40 quid a spool, as I said. And then coming through, yes, some of those other ones. So Suffix 832 I'm a big fan of, which is an 8-strand. There is a new one called Suffix 131. Haven't used it yet. Might have a try it at some stage. It's the 12-strand with another single strand of something else in it. I think it's like a Dyneema core or something like that. So it ends up being 13-strand 131. Again, quite expensive, but very, very good. Power Pro is your tough as old boots type stuff. Again, Power Pro Super 8, I think I was using the old Super 8. There's a new Super 8 that comes out. Again, I haven't tried it. Some people, you're going to see this online all the time. People making recommendations, people saying, oh, I had a bad batch of that. That one's rubbish. That's too expensive, whatever. To a certain degree, you've got to figure it out for yourselves. But I'm just going to give you, I'm just giving you a rundown of what I like to use. So there we go, guys. Little bit about braid, little bit about PE, little bit about PE rating system. Try not to use it because all the companies have got it mashed up in the end. It's meant to be a standardized chart and it ends up being a complete mess on diameter. So just a quick last note. The reason that diameters are very, very difficult is because braid is so soft and so supple. So when you get the diameter of a line, it's you want to use what's called a micrometer. So if you've got a monofilament, it's actually got a hardness to it that you get your micrometer, you tighten it down, and then you read, and it gives you a very, very accurate, to 2 or 3 decimal places of a millimeter of how thick that line is. Very, very easy to do with mono. Very, very easy to do with fluorocarbon. But when you get a braid in there, even a round profile 8-strand braid, you put it in a micrometer and it squashes so much. You can never actually tell, well, what's the diameter of it, or how much am I squashing it to get that diameter? So diameters can be incredibly inflated. Some of these brands, some companies are trying to get away telling you it's the thinnest ever and the breaking strain's super high. So you might select it, go out to use it and think that's not like I've pulled out, I've hit a snag and it's broken like cotton straight away. It's not the dye, or you get it out the spool and you think you'll get to know, even though how thin they are, you get to know through the feel. I can tell now roughly a super thin braid, a 0.10 mil braid, 15, 20 and above. I can roughly ballpark it just through feel. But yeah, it's incredibly, sometimes you pull it out of the spool and it says, yeah, it's a 0.10 mil braid, and you go, never in a million years is that 0.10 mil. So maybe they squashed it a bit too much while they were making, their readings. Maybe they're over embellishing and to basically telling a few porkies in order to try and make that sale on their packaging. So that's where the minefield comes from. But hopefully this video has cleared up a few things for you. So a few recommendations on my rods and reels, a few recommendations on what braid is, when you would use it, and the difference compared to the other materials that you could use on your reel. So there we go, guys. It's kind of blown my noodle just trying to get through all of that. Some of it might have been a bit boring. Hopefully it was useful to a few of you. If it was, give us a like, give us a subscribe, and yeah, Tom Hunt in the kit room, and I'll see you on the next one.